Kia ora koutou katoa. If you're here for a Wharekaho Simpsons Beach meeting on the coastal hazards, then you're in the right place. So welcome. We're just going to pause a minute or so just to allow people who haven't joined right on 7 o'clock, and it's not even 7 o'clock yet, to come in. But just while you're there, if people are able to turn off their microphones and their videos, that would be good. It just helps with the flow of the meeting. Sometimes we have connection issues. So it's just on 7 o'clock. I'll start with some introductions. So if anyone does miss the introductions, it's not the most important part of the meeting. But firstly, myself, I'm Amon, the project lead for the Shoreline Management Plan. So it's a pretty big project, a big responsibility, but it's not just me doing this project. There's quite a few people supporting this one, and probably the most important one today is I'll introduce Connie, and she'll be facilitating some of the questions.
Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, Connie. And John, happy for you to stay on the screen if you aren't able to turn your video off, but if you can, that would be good as well. So there are probably a couple more people to introduce. I'm just looking at the guests. So Nick Lewis is one of our consultants. He's with us now.
Hi all.
Kia ora, Nick. And then we've got Sian Joan, who's maybe joining us. She's a key part of the project, supporting us from the consultant side as well. Alejandro, kia ora, from Waikato Regional Council. He's here tonight.
Kia ora koutou.
And I think we're pretty good. There might be Jamie Boyle, our coastal scientist. He's probably join us in a few minutes. So we'll get started. I'm going to go through a presentation, but there's a lot of chance for questions and things. So I'll try and share my screen and start up that presentation. So Wharekaho with Simpsons Beach, that's why we're here today. The main purpose is to ensure there's an awareness of the project, especially to the people or the properties that may be most affected by some of the coastal hazards. Secondly, we want to encourage feedback on what we're doing with the project, and specifically the proposed pathways. So some of the options we're suggesting over time. So those are the two key purposes there. And how we're going to do that is we're going to go through what the Shoreline Management Plan is. We're going to provide an overview because Wharekaho is pretty important, but it's a much bigger project. It's a project that covers the whole district, so all of the Coromandel. Then we're going to focus in a bit on Wharekaho and some of the specific details. So what are the hazards there, or you could almost say, what is the hazard in Wharekaho? And lastly, we want to talk about how to provide feedback. So there's a bit on providing feedback at the end, but important, you can provide feedback through the chat at any time as I'm presenting. And then as we get to points during the presentation, I'll look for Connie to read out the questions or read out just the feedback that's provided where I can, and hopefully I can or others can answer any questions right then and there. If they're really tricky, we could have to come back to you, but so far we're mostly able to answer most questions. So the first thing in terms of giving some context to a Shoreline Management Plan and the work that we're doing, this work's been going on for 3 years. It followed a really big event, I think in 2019, mostly on the Thames coast, and that's one of the pictures in the middle. So the Thames coast got hammered, but it's not just the Thames coast, it's all around the district. You've got examples of coastal erosion and inundation or flooding. So those two hazards, coastal erosion and flooding, are the key ones for the project. There's other things we've looked at. So we recognise that rivers and coastlines interact. So we've had some look at river interaction. We've looked at cliff instability, and we've also considered things like tsunamis. So we've looked at those other hazards, stormwater a little bit in some cases as well, but not in as much detail as the inundation or the coastal erosion. So those are the two things that the project is really focused on. So you don't have to go far around the coast to find examples of where we've got challenges as a council and as a community, and this plan is trying to understand the scale of the challenge and work out a path forward, and that's looking over 100 years, so not just a short time period. How we're doing this is we're following the guidance that's been put out by the Ministry for the Environment in 2017. And so that's really helpful. There's a chart here, and it kind of starts out with 1 and 2 with what's happening. So understanding sea level rise or hazard assessments, storm events, erosion scenarios, then looking at what matters to people. So what's at risk? Is it homes? Is it roads or schools? So what's vulnerable? And then we start thinking about options. But options include not just a single option, but a number of options over time. So we call those pathways. So we've had quite a few meetings in this project already, and probably 3 or 4 that kind of line up with each of those phases of what's happening in terms of the hazard, what's important to the community, and what we can do about it. So mostly in Whitianga for the ones that are specific to Wharekaho. And then the other thing that goes alongside that is who's doing this project. So it is a TCDC led or initiated project, but probably more important than TCDC or other councils and partners is our coastal panels. So these aren't employees of council or consultants. These are representatives of the community. So earlier on the project, we had nominations, and we selected about 10 or 12 people for each coastal panel. There's 4 coastal panels, one for the Mercury Bay area, and they've got Thames Coast, Coromandel, and you've got the southeast. So those coastal panels is where all the really interesting, difficult work gets done. That's where we take the hazard information, we allow that to be understood, we ask questions about it, we test it, we get advice from the panel on what the options should be, what they think is acceptable to the community, how much risk there is. So they're the ones, supported by the project team, that are really developing and leading some of this work. So it's not just the coastal panels though. The technical team supporting them is called a TAG, or Technical Advisory Group. So you've got the council staff, the TCDC staff, you've got Waikato Regional Council staff, you've got Waka Kotahi, and we've got our consultants, Raw Haskoning, their names just down the bottom. So really important to have that technical support and behind the project. And then you take another step up, and you've got a governance committee. So the governance committee is made up of 4 TCDC councillors and 4 iwi representatives. So on that governance committee, you've got Tony Fox is probably the one for the Mercury Bay area, and Joe Davis is the iwi rep for the area as well. So very relevant to Wharekaho. In terms of just back a step of that first step, values and objective, it's not the first step, but it's number 3. What we did early on the project is, through the public meetings and through some online surveys, got an understanding of what were the most important things to the wider community. So access is important, being able to, and you can see that in the middle of that word map there. So access is really key. The natural environment stands out really key. The beaches are really important. And so living on the Coromandel, those natural aspects in the beaches from a community's perspective stand out pretty strongly. But you can see a number of different things in there, lifestyle and tourism and all sorts of things, but those are some of the things that stood out really strongly. So just a little bit on the risk or hazard assessments. So it's one thing to understand the hazard, so that when we talk about a hazard, we kind of think of a flooding extent, and this, what's shown here is Thames. And you can see in a really big event, Thames could get, or a large part of Thames could get wet. But it's not just getting wet that's a problem. If there's nothing that gets wet, if it's just sports fields and paddocks, probably very resilient, and they can get wet and there might not be too much damage. So it's also considering what's vulnerable and how vulnerable and how much it's exposed. And once you think about all those things, then you understand the risk. So we've gone through quite a process of looking at the hazard and then the things that are at risk behind those, and a number of iterations. Sometimes where there's very little houses or infrastructure, we've kept it at high level. In other cases, like Whirianga, Thames, Wharekaho, we've drilled down a bit further. So that has given you an introduction to what we're doing. Just highlighting that any comments or questions are welcome throughout the presentation. So if there's anything there at the moment, I'll answer those questions. But just recapping, it's been going on for 3 years. It's focused on inundation, so flooding from the coast and erosion from the coast. And it's a long-term project, so it's looking out to 100 years. So those are some of the key things about the project. Connie, any questions or comments thus far?
Thanks very much, Eamon, and hi everyone. And to those people who have joined us after Eamon's introduction, we're going to be using the chat thread to take your questions to Eamon tonight. If you haven't used Teams before, if you look along the top of your screen, you'll see a speech bubble with 2 lines in it. If you click on that, it will bring up the chat thread, and you can just type your questions in there, and I will read them, and I'll read them out so that you can get an answer here tonight. The other thing you can do is just use that as a place to leave your comments, and we will save it and make sure that that's added to the feedback on the project. If for any reason you don't get a chance to use the chat or you can't quite figure it out, that's cool. We'll have an email address and you can send us your feedback that way, and Eamon will take you through other ways that you can provide your feedback at the end of this session. So we don't have any questions there at the moment, Eamon, but perhaps everyone can take a look at it and figure it out, and they can pop their comments in there as you're talking through the next bit.
Great, thanks very much, Connie. And just so you get a feel of where we're heading, we're hoping to or expecting to adopt the plan in September. So what you'll see shortly isn't necessarily a final pathway or suggestion. And the comments we receive tonight and through emails and through over the next kind of 3 or 4 weeks, month, we're going to use that for another iteration of the pathways and the solutions. So important that you do, if you have comments or questions, please do put them in. So the things we're going to talk about specifically for Wharekaho is the hazard assessment, the solutions and the proposed pathways. So this map here has quite a lot of information. I'm just going to try and talk through it quite slowly. It's important that you do get a feel of what we're showing or what it means in terms of the hazards. And I'm actually going to start with inundation. And interesting to start there, because this is probably the good news for tonight is there's very little inundation risk for Wharekaho. You can see a lot of the houses are higher and therefore are unlikely to get flooded in a really big event. Not only are they unlikely to get flooded now, but in a sea level rise scenario, they're also unlikely to be flooded. But thinking about the sea level rise scenarios, so we've looked at things in increments of 0.2, and if you look at so it goes 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, and you look up the river here, you can see there would be some flooding around the river, and as sea level rise happens, there would be expected to be some more flooding out in the future. So the reason I started with that one is just to get a bit of a feel for sea level rise, because sea level rise will impact how erosion happens in Wharekaho. So the predictions for erosion do take into account sea level rise. So when we think about sea level rise, in the short term, there is a bit of certainty in terms of how much sea level rise we expect. So this is a graph that shows different scenarios, the red one being the worst and the green one being the best. So in 20 years time, or 2040, we're predicted that we will have between 0.2 and 0.3 metres sea level rise, and there's a little bit of certainty, or a lot more certainty about that. But as you look out, say 50 years, the amount of sea level rise becomes more uncertain. 100 years, even more uncertain. So there is some uncertainty the further you look out, and that's just the sea level rise scenario. So if globally there's reductions in emissions, potentially that green line could be one we expect. But if they get worse or stay the same, it's more likely to be the red lines. This information is updated all the time or periodically, and recent projections are slightly worse than you can see on this graph. Not from my understanding, not significantly worse, but definitely not any better. So that's useful to understand that there is some uncertainty long term. And then taking you to what is the real hazard for Wharekaho, or the predicted hazard, is the erosion. And so the legend shows what we expect to kind of happen over a period of time. So you've got kind of current vegetation lines, or erosion lines, 2020 and moving back to 2040, 2070. And so that orange one is 2070, and it's probably about there from these predictions that some of the houses are really starting to be at risk. But then you go further another 50 years, and that's taking into account quite a lot of sea level rise, anticipated sea level rise. The houses are definitely at risk, and there's issues there. The next two lines, the black one and the dotted line, those are the lines that are currently in the TCDC district plan. So they're the coastal erosion line, current in black, and future line, which is dotted. So they do definitely match up very closely in the southern part of Wharekaho, and in the northern part, what we've predicted recently is it's going to be slightly worse, or a reasonable amount worse than the predictions in our district plan. So that's the challenge we're having to deal with. And then the next thing we think about is solutions. So just taking a second to understand that those are the lines, and in the long term, those are the challenges to deal with. So the next thing we think about is solutions. So we, in terms of the project team and the coastal panel, we think really broadly about what the solutions might be. If possible, and there isn't development, avoiding development is often the best approach. So don't put something in a place that's going to be a problem. Potentially unlikely in this case, or might be one or two options, but retreat within a property, relocating a house on a property could be an option, as could rising floor levels. So that option is really relevant for when inundation or flooding is an issue. And then the last one is protecting. So protecting could be our wall, which is a hard asset. So we call them soft and hard. And so walls, concrete walls or sheet piling walls are pretty hard, obstructive assets. So are rocks, and then you start working your way back to vegetation. So very, very soft. And you've got something called soft engineering in the middle. That's what we refer to as you may have some rocks or some like logs or some other structures that have then been planted on top of, or you may reshape some of the dunes to establish plants. So that's useful to know that we've thought about these different options, but we've also thought about them against the values that the wider community have given us at the start of the project. So that is the access. In this case, very little risk relating to access, but the beach and the nature are things that we've had to weigh up against. So in terms of the hazard assessments, are there any questions on those?
We don't have any questions in the chat at the moment, Amon, but what I'm going to do as well in there is I'll just pop in the email address if people are taking notes, perhaps with pen and paper, and want to send an email later. I'll pop in the email address that you can send those to. Otherwise, do feel free to use the chat as we carry on.
Thank you, Connie. So this is probably one of the key things of the meeting. What are we proposing should happen? And so what we're proposing now is what we want feedback on. And we will consider the feedback, us and the project team, along with council when it gets to council, and we will potentially change, but we will also consider any feedback alongside all the other feedback we've had. So a bit of yes, we should do that definitely, maintain the sand dunes and rehabilitate native species on the dunes and manage access. So access can actually cause problems with the dunes, cause them to erode. So making sure that there's defined access points and we're not causing problems, making sure that our planting programs, where appropriate, are well resourced. And so that's what we're saying we need to do in the short term. Short term and medium term. Then once or if when we start to see erosion eating into those dunes, then we think soft engineering to enhance the dunes is appropriate. We think that will be appropriate for quite a long time. However, we don't think it will be viable for 100 years. So when you get to a certain point in time, potentially 80 or 100 years away, then there would need to be a planned retreat from those areas. So the houses, the erosion would come back to the houses, they would get very close, and we would need to plan for that in advance of it actually happening. So as we start seeing erosion bite and possibly influenced by sea level rise, or would definitely be influenced by sea level rise, we would need to start planning for the long-term eventuality of when the houses were at risk or erosion was at risk. There's some scales on the bottom, often, well, in a way that represents time, but it's really hard, particularly with erosion, to understand what time frames we're talking about. So some of the triggers we've put in are also open for feedback or discussion. So the first one is when we start to see existing dune starting to be eroded away, might be 4 meters or 50%. That's a signal for when we start thinking about and planning for soft engineering. And then when we get to the existing dune having eroded away 80%, that's when we start doing those soft engineering options. And then the next one on the bottom is when you've actually got no defences, so that the dunes or things in front of properties have been washed away. That's starting to mean we need to transfer to a different option and ultimately managed retreat. The thing that we do say, and it's a correct thing to say, we do plan for the worst, and so when we're thinking about the worst, skip back there, we plan for this sea level rise increments increasing and the erosion causing a problem. If it doesn't happen, or if it happens a lot slower, that's a really good thing, but we are needing to plan for it. And this is not just here, but right across the district that we're planning. So when you think about those time frames, if you look at this map here, you can see potentially 2070 is when the erosion's going to really cause a problem, but we want to be doing things before the things get to that orange line. So having that soft engineering possibly will slow down that 2070 line. So the orange line might be 2100 if the soft engineering works really well. So that's I'll leave this slide up, but that's the point where we ask for questions and any more comments or any comments.
The first question that we have, Amon, is what does managing access mean?
So sometimes kids often run over sand dunes, or there are people that in some instances have boats with wheels and they use those to drive over sand dunes. We can and do put bollards to manage access, and we encourage or we fence access. So there's a fence through the sand dune so that the pathway is well defined and limits the amount of trekking over the sand dune. Yeah, those are the types of things that manage access means. It's hard to think. I'm familiar with the new swings and that playground area, and that's quite a well-defined access. But it's hard to think exactly what other access points there are, and a lot of them probably come directly from houses. Just remembering what's there.
Thanks, Amon. The next question that we have is, what impact will the SMP have on future building consents for shoreline buildings?
That's a good question. Probably in some ways, if you look at this line here, the anticipated erosion is already contained within our district plan. So the rules and the restrictions that are there now in most of these areas are unlikely to change. There are challenges with rebuilding a house in an erosion-prone area. So there are things that you have to do already, and it's possible that there will be an update to include the red lines or change the lines in the northern part of the beach. That's not a definite, but that's a possibility. So to answer the question as it's written, there may not be that many change, but we can expect over time for it to become more difficult to build in a hazard area. There's that, and there's a few other aspects relating to a hazard area that I'll come back to, but I'll take the questions first.
Thanks. We have a question just about the image that we're looking at. I note the flooding on the northern river, but the stream at the south doesn't seem to note any real impact. Is that correct?
Yeah, what how this hazard is assessed is its coastal hazard. So what you're seeing is just a coastal hazard. And so how far the sea will go up the river is what you're seeing. So from that perspective, the river at the north is lower, or the land surrounding that river is lower, and therefore the sea can move its way up into the surrounding area. And to the south, the land is much steeper. And so generally speaking, yes, that's correct.
Thanks, Amon. One more question. Are the stormwater drains going to be addressed as they cause erosion?
That isn't on our radar for the primary cause of erosion at Wharekaho Simpsons Beach. So I don't know what scale of erosion that is causing, but definitely good feedback to hear tonight, and something for us to include into our thinking, into our planning. That has come up in other areas in terms of erosion being caused by stormwater. Often when we've looked at it, it's correct. There is an element of erosion, but it's quite small relative to the anticipated long-term erosion. So you can address the stormwater outlet and improve things, but that's not going to stop the erosion from the sea, or that larger long-term erosion.
Thanks, Amon. That's all the comments and questions we have at the moment, but thanks everyone for putting those in there, and just carry on adding them as Amon's talking through the next section, and I'll read them out when we get to the next question time.
Good. Probably one thing I did just want to highlight is even though we're suggesting soft engineering as an option to limit the erosion, as a group in a coastal panel, we are not advocating for hard rocks. The idea of putting rocks along the beach has been considered, and when we considered that, other committee have said are important. We don't think rock armouring this beach is the way to go. Not sure if that came across clearly, but just wanted to make sure that was something that was stated. There was a question about building consents, and I answered that. There's also potential long-term for some of there to be insurance challenges. So it's hard to know exactly how the insurance industry will evolve, but there's a lot of discussion and legislation put forward that ensures insurance costs and hazards, and assigns the costs where the risks lie. So that is something to consider. But it's also in a way worth noting that a lot of this isn't tomorrow, isn't next year, isn't 10 years away. It's actually medium and long term. That's going to be the biggest challenge. So if there are questions or further comments, still open to answering those, but we're going to switch across to how to provide feedback. And so right now, there's been a little bit, but definitely we'll welcome more. The email address, our coast at tcdc.govt.nz, as we can send email information. But also good, and I'm going to just go away from the presentation for a minute, is our website. So we've got a tcdc.govt.nz, which is standard website, but if you put a / and then an SMP, that will take you to the Shoreline Management Plan website. On here, we've got some advertising about the events or the presentations. So tomorrow night we'll be doing one for Cook's Beach, which is more exposed to flooding than erosion, so slightly different challenge there. But if you drill down, there is a feedback tool. And so this place right here, by clicking on here, you can open up a tool that shows you how to provide feedback to Wharekaho, or it could be to whirianga, or it might be you're concerned about kuatunu, or just the access points going past Tairua. So you can provide feedback anywhere along the district or around this project. Sian, I'm not sure if you're with us or whether I'll have a go at demonstrating this.
I am, Amon. You happy for me to fire away?
Yes, please. Yes, please, Sian. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. It won't take a moment. So hopefully you have that. Now, you should be seeing the screen that Amon was. You're not seeing it? Is that right? Or you are seeing it? You are, great, sorry. So this is the screen Amon was showing you. You click on this link on the website. It takes you to this consultation tool. And it, as Amon's just described, it provides you with a link, a map, the whole of the Coromandel, and access to all of these adaptation plans. So on the front page, there's a bit of a description as to what the project's about, the types of questions and the type of feedback we'd like to get from you. But largely it relates to what your views are on the hazards we've identified, and the pathways we've recommended. In effect, do you agree? Do you have a different view? We'd really like to hear about that and anything else you think we need to take account of. And then there's instructions on how to leave comments. But the key to it all is the map. So if you click on the button at the top here, it takes you to a map, the map of the Coromandel. There's another repeat of the instructions just to make it really clear what you need to do. You just accept it, go OK, and then you can see, obviously, the coast. So you then can zoom into any part of the coast you want to go to. I've done that already here, and I've zoomed in on the part of the coast we're talking about tonight, so Wharekaho Simpsons Beach here. And you can see that other people have left some comments, not on Wharekaho, but on Brophy's Beach, Buffalo Beach, and so on. And then if you click on any part of this coast, it then takes you to the further information about that stretch of coast. It shows you what the hazards, predicted hazards are, and what the adaptation pathway is. Then if you click again, it takes you to that poster. So you can look at that in much more detail and on a much larger screen if you want to study this and get more information on it. So if you want to leave a comment though, there's a button here, add comment, click on that. And then it asks you to add a new feature. You do that. And it basically gives you this pointer, and you can put that pointer wherever you want to talk about. You click it onto the map, and then you type your comment. And at the end, it tells you to finish, and away you go. So that allows you to say anything in any specific location that you're interested in. So you can see here, you can put your name in. You don't have to, or you just add your comment into the comment box. Click create, and then it's saved. So that's the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian. So that's all in terms of the presentation. Probably a couple of things to reiterate is the project is looking to be adopted in September, so that gives us a plan. That's not the end, I suppose, of the work that's required to be done. That gives you a plan. Actually, when we need to do any soft engineering or we do planting, that comes next. Some of that's already happening in terms of planting. So there's a plan, but then you've got to implement the plan. And some of it, in regards to soft engineering for Wharekaho, might not be for 5-10 years away. And the longer away it is, the better, because that means we're not actually having erosion. And we are looking to adopt in September, but also coming back to having a face-to-face meeting in whirianga. So the meeting will be for Mercury Bay, but it will include Wharekaho, gives you a chance to come in person, ask questions directly, talk to me and the project team about what we're doing. And so that meeting is, I will quickly try and pull up my calendar just to get a date. It's about a month away. So it's in June, the weekend of the 25th. We've got Te Puru, so that's not the right one. So Whitianga, we've penciled in the 18th of June. So only just locked in that date in terms of the 18th of June in Whitianga to talk about this in person. And so if you do want to come along, then definitely do, and we can talk in person as well. But thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Appreciate those comments. Do send them through if you've got more questions. Have a good evening. I hope we've achieved our objective of raising awareness, and we've got a bit of feedback, so that's great as well. Okay, good night everyone.